Chapter 7 Part 3 of The Worst Journey in the World, Volume 1, by Apsley Cherry-Garrard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7 The First Winter, Part 3. It is at Cape Crozier that the Barrier edge, which runs for 400 miles as an ice cliff up to 200 feet high, meets the land. The Barrier is moving against this land at a rate which is sometimes not much less than a mile in a year. Perhaps you can imagine the chaos which it piles up. There are pressure ridges compared to which the waves of the sea are like a ploughed field. These are worst at Cape Crozier itself, but they extend all along the southern slopes of Mount Terror, running parallel with the land, and the disturbance which Cape Crozier makes is apparent at Corner Camp some 40 miles back on the Barrier, in the crevasses we used to find and the occasional ridges we had to cross. In the Discovery days the pressure just where it hit Cape Crozier formed a small bay, and on the sea ice frozen in this bay the men of the Discovery found the only emperor penguin rookery which had ever been seen. The ice here was not blown out by the blizzards which cleared the Ross Sea, and open water or open leads were never far away. This gave the emperors a place to lay their eggs and an opportunity to find their food. We had therefore to find our way along the pressure to the Knoll, and thence penetrate through the pressure to the Emperor's Bay, and we had to do it in the dark. Terror Point, which we were approaching in the fog, is a short 20 miles from the Knoll, and ends in a long snow tongue running out into the Barrier. The way had been travelled a good many times in Discovery days and in daylight, and Wilson knew there was a narrow path, free from crevasses, which skirted along between the mountain and the pressure ridges running parallel to it. But it is one thing to walk along a corridor by day, and quite another to try to do so at night, especially when there are no walls by which you can correct your course, only crevasses. Anyway, Terror Point must be somewhere close to us now, and vaguely in front of us was that strip of snow, neither barrier nor mountain, which was our only way forward. We began to realise, now that our eyes were more or less out of action, how much we could do with our feet and ears. The effect of walking in finnesko is much the same as walking in gloves, and you get a sense of touch which nothing else except bare feet could give you. Thus we could feel every small variation in surface, every crust through which our feet broke, every hardened patch below the soft snow, and soon we began to rely more and more upon the sound of our footsteps to tell us whether we were on crevasses or solid ground. From now onwards we were working among crevasses fairly constantly. I loathe them in full daylight, when much can be done to avoid them, and when, if you fall into them, you can at any rate see where the sides are, which way they run, and how best to scramble out. When your companions can see how to stop the sledge, to which you are all attached by your harness, how most safely to hold the sledge when stopped, how, if you are dangling 15 feet down in a chasm, to work above you to get you up to the surface again. And then our clothes were generally something like clothes. Even under the ideal conditions of good light, warmth and no wind, crevasses are beastly, whether you are pulling over a level and uniform snow surface, never knowing what moment will find you dropping into some bottomless pit, or whether you are rushing for the alpine rope and the sledge to help some companion who has disappeared. I dream sometimes now of bad days we had on the Beardmore and elsewhere, when men were dropping through to be caught up and hang at the full length of the harnesses and toggles many times in an hour. On the same sledge as myself on the Beardmore, one man went down once head first, and another 8 times to the length of his harness in 25 minutes. And always you wondered whether your harness was going to hold when the jerk came. But those days were a Sunday school treat compared to our days of blind man's buff with the emperor penguins among the crevasses of Cape Crozier. Our troubles were greatly increased by the state of our clothes. If we had been dressed in lead we should have been able to move our arms and necks and heads more easily than we could now. If the same amount of icing had extended to our legs, I believe we should still be there, standing unable to move. But happily the forks of our trousers still remained movable. To get into our canvas harnesses was the most absurd business. Quite in the early days of our journey we met with this difficulty, and somewhat foolishly decided not to take off our harness for lunch. The harnesses thawed in the tent, and froze back as hard as boards. Likewise our clothing was hard as boards, and stuck out from our bodies in every imaginable fold and angle. To fit one board over the other required the united efforts of the would-be wearer and his two companions, and the process had to be repeated for each one of us twice a day. Goodness knows how long it took, but it cannot have been less than 5 minutes thumping at each man. As we approached Terror Point in the fog, we sensed that we had risen and fallen over several rises. Every now and then we felt hard slippery snow under our feet. Every now and then our feet went through crusts in the surface. And then quite suddenly, vague, indefinable, monstrous, there loomed a something ahead. I remember having a feeling as of ghosts about as we untoggled our harnesses from the sledge, and, thus roped, walked upwards on that ice. The moon was showing a ghastly ragged mountainous edge above us in the fog, and as we rose we found that we were on a pressure ridge. We stopped, looked at one another, and then bang! Right under our feet. More bangs and creaks and groans, for that ice was moving and splitting like glass. The cracks went off all round us, and some of them ran along for hundreds of yards. Afterwards we got used to it, but at first the effect was very jumpy. From first to last during this journey we had plenty of variety and none of that monotony which is inevitable in sledging over long distances of a Barrier in summer, only the long shivering fits following close one after the other all the time we lay in our dreadful sleeping bags. Hour after hour and night after night in those temperatures they were as monotonous as could be. Later we got frostbitten even as we lay in our sleeping bags. Things are getting pretty bad when you get frostbitten in your bag. There was only a glow where the moon was. We stood in a moonlit fog, and this was sufficient to show the edge of another ridge ahead, and yet another on our left. We were utterly bewildered. The deep booming of the ice continued, and it may be that the tide had something to do with this, though we were many miles from the ordinary coastal ice. We went back, toggled up to our sledges again, and pulled in what we thought was the right direction, always with that feeling that the earth may open underneath your feet, which you have in crevassed areas. But all we found were more mounds and banks of snow and ice, into which we almost ran before we saw them. We were clearly lost. It was near midnight, and I wrote, "It may be the pressure ridges, or it may be Terror. It is impossible to say, and I should think it is impossible to move till it clears." We were steering N.E. when we got here, and returned S.W. till we seemed to be in a hollow, and camped. The temperature had been rising from -36 at 11 a.m. and it was now -27°. Snow was falling and nothing whatever could be seen. From under the tent came noises as though some giant was banging a big empty tank. All the signs were for a blizzard, and indeed we had not long finished our supper and were thawing our way little by little into our bags when the wind came away from the south. Before it started we got a glimpse of black rock and knew we must be in the pressure ridges where they nearly join Mount Terror. It is with great surprise that in looking up the records I find that blizzard lasted 3 days, the temperature and wind both rising till it was +9°, and blowing force 9 on the morning of the second day, July 11th. On the morning of the third day, July 12th, it was blowing storm force 10. The temperature had thus risen over 80°. It was not an uncomfortable time, wet and warm. The risen temperature allowed all our ice to turn to water, and we lay steaming and beautifully liquid, and wondered sometimes what we should be like when our gear froze up once more. But we did not do much wondering, I suspect. We slept. From that point of view these blizzards were a perfect godsend. We also revised our food rations. From the moment we started to prepare for this journey we were asked by Scott to try certain experiments in view of the plateau stage of the Polar Journey in the following summer. It was supposed that the plateau stage would be the really tough part of the Polar Journey, and no one then dreamed that harder conditions could be found in the middle of the Barrier in March than on the plateau, 10,000 feet higher, in February. In view of the extreme conditions we knew we must meet on this winter journey, far harder of course in point of weather than anything experienced on the Polar Journey, we had determined to simplify our food to the last degree. We only bought pemmican, biscuit, butter and tea. And tea is not a food, only a pleasant stimulant and hot. The pemmican was excellent and came from Beauvais, Copenhagen. The immediate advantage of this was that we had few food bags to handle for each meal. If the air temperature is 100° of frost, then everything in the air is about 100° of frost too. You have only to untie the lashings of one bag in a -70° temperature, with your feet frozen and your fingers just nursed back after getting a match to strike for the candle, you will have tried several boxes metal to realise this as an advantage. The immediate and increasing pressing disadvantage is that you have no sugar. Have you ever had a craving for sugar which never leaves you, even when asleep? It is unpleasant. As a matter of fact, the craving for sweet things never seriously worried us on this journey, and there must have been some sugar in our biscuits which gave a pleasant sweetness to our midday tea, or nicely hot water when broken up and soaked in it. These biscuits were specially made for us by Huntley and Palmer. Their composition was worked out by Wilson and that firm's chemist, and is a secret, but they are probably the most satisfying biscuit ever made, and I doubt whether they can be improved upon. There were two kinds called Emergency and Antarctic, but there was, I think, little difference between them except in the baking. A well-baked biscuit was good to eat when sledging if your supply of food was good, but if you were very hungry an underbaked one was much preferred. By taking individually different quantities of biscuit, pemmican and butter, we were able to roughly test the proportion of proteids, fats and carbohydrates wanted by the human body under such extreme circumstances. Bill was all for fat, starting with 8 ounces of butter, 12 ounces of pemmican and only 12 ounces of biscuits a day. Bowers told me he was going for proteids, 16 ounces of pemmican and 16 ounces of biscuit, and suggested I should go the whole hog on carbohydrates. I did not like this, since I knew I should want more fat, but the rations were to be altered as necessary during the journey, so there was no harm in trying. So I started with 20 ounces of biscuits and 12 ounces of pemmican a day. Bowers was all right, this was usual with him, but he did not eat all his extra pemmican. Bill could not eat all his extra butter, but was satisfied. I got hungry, certainly got more frostbitten than the others, and wanted more fat. I also got heartburn. However, before taking more fat I increased my biscuits to 24 ounces, but this did not satisfy me. I wanted fat. Bill and I now took the same diet, he giving me 4 ounces of butter which he could not eat, and I giving him 4 ounces of biscuits which did not satisfy my wants. We both therefore had 12 ounces of pemmican, 16 ounces of biscuit and 4 ounces of butter a day, but we did not always finish our butter. This is an extremely good ration, and we had enough to eat during most of this journey. We certainly could not have faced the conditions without. I will not say that I was entirely easy in my mind as we lay out that blizzard somewhere off Terror Point. I don't know how the others were feeling. The unearthly banging going on underneath us may have had something to do with it, but we were quite lost in the pressure, and it might be the deuce and all to get out in the dark. The wind eddied and swirled quite out of its usual straightforward way, and the tent got badly snowed up. Our sledge had disappeared long ago. The position was not altogether a comfortable one. Tuesday night and Wednesday it blew up to force 10, temperature from -7° to +2°, and then it began to modify and get squally. By 3 a.m. on Thursday, July 13th, the wind had nearly ceased, the temperature was falling and the stars were shining through detached clouds. We were soon getting our breakfast, which always consisted of tea followed by pemmican. We soaked our biscuits in both. Then we set to work to dig out the sledges and tent, a big job taking several hours. At last we got started. In that jerky way in which I was still managing to jot a few sentences down each night as a record, I wrote: "Did 7½ miles during day. Seems a marvellous run. Rose and fell over several ridges of Terror. In afternoon suddenly came on huge crevasse on one of these. We were quite high on Terror. Moon saved us walking in. It might have taken sledge and all." To do 7 miles in a day, a distance which had taken us nearly a week in the past, was very heartening. The temperature was between -20 and -30 all day, and that was good too. When crossing the undulations which ran down out of the mountains into the true pressure ridges on our right, we found that the wind which came down off the mountain struck along the top of the undulation, and flowing each way caused a north-easterly breeze on one side and a north-westerly breeze on the other. There seemed to be wind in the sky, and the blizzard had not cleared as far away as we should have wished. During the time through which we had come it was by burning more oil than is usually allowed for cooking that we kept going at all. After each meal was cooked we allowed the primers to burn on for a while, and thus warmed up the tent. Then we could nurse back our frozen feet and do any necessary little odd jobs. More often we just sat and nodded for a few minutes, keeping one another from going too deeply to sleep. But it was running away with the oil. We started with 6 one-gallon tins. Those tins Scott had criticised, and we now had used 4 of them. At first we said we must have at least 2 1-gallon tins with which to go back, but by now our estimate had come down to 1 full gallon tin and 2 full primus lamps. Our sleeping bags were awful. It took me, even as early in the journey as this, an hour of pushing and thumping and cramp every night to thaw out enough of mine to get into it at all. Even that was not so bad as lying in them when we got there. Only -35°, but a very bad night, according to my diary. We got away in good time, but it was a ghastly day and my nerves were quivering at the end, for we could not find that straight and narrow way which led between the crevasses on either hand. Time after time we found we were out of our course by the sudden fall of the ground beneath our feet. In we went, and then, "Are we too far right?" Nobody knows. "Well, let's try nearer to the mountain," and so forth. By hard slogging 2 3/4 miles this morning, then on in thick gloom, which suddenly lifted and we found ourselves under a huge mountain of pressure ridge, looking black in shadow. We went on, bending to the left when Bill fell and put his arm into a crevasse. We went over this and another, and some time after got somewhere up to the left, and both Bill and I put a foot into a crevasse. We sounded all about, and everywhere was hollow, and so we ran the sledge down over it, and all was well. Once we got right into the pressure and took a longish time to get out again. Bill lengthened his trace out with the Alpine rope now, and often afterwards, so he found the crevasses well ahead of us and the sledge. Nice for us, but not so nice for Bill. Crevasses in the dark do put your nerves on edge. When we started next morning, July 15th, we could see on our left front and more or less on top of us the Knoll, which is a big hill whose precipitous cliffs to seaward form Cape Crozier. The sides of it sloped down towards us, and pressing against its ice cliffs on ahead were miles and miles of great pressure ridges, along which we had travelled, and which hemmed us in. Mount Terror rose 10,000 feet high on our left, and was connected with the Knoll by a great cup-like drift of wind-polished snow. The slope of this in one place runs gently out onto the corridor along which we had sledged, and here we turned and started to pull our sledges up. There were no crevasses, only the great drift of snow, so hard that we used our crampons just as though we had been on ice, and as polished as the china sides of a giant cup which it resembled. For 3 miles we slogged up, until we were only 150 yards from the moraine shelf where we were going to build our hut of rocks and snow. This moraine was above us on our left. The twin peaks of the Knoll were across the cup on our right, and here, 800 feet up the mountain side, we pitched our last camp. We had arrived. What should we call our hut? How soon could we get our clothes and bags dry? How would the blubber stove work? Would the penguins be there? It seems too good to be true. 19 days out. Surely seldom has any one been so wet. Our bags hardly possible to get into, our wind clothes just frozen boxes. Birdie's patent balaclava is like iron. It is wonderful how our cares have vanished. It was evening, but we were so keen to begin that we went straight up to the ridge above our camp where the rock cropped out from the snow. We found that most of it was in situ, but that there were plenty of boulders, some gravel, and of course any amount of the icy snow which fell away below us down to our tent, and the great pressure about a mile beyond. Between us and that pressure, as we were to find out afterwards, was a great ice cliff. The pressure ridges and the great ice barrier beyond were at our feet, the Ross Sea edge but some 4 miles away. The Emperors must be somewhere around that shoulder of the Knoll which hides Cape Crozier itself from our view. Our scheme was to build an igloo with rock walls banked up with snow, using a 9-foot sledge as a ridge beam, and a large sheet of green Willesden canvas as a roof. We had also brought a board to form a lintel over the door. Here, with the stove, which was to be fed with blubber from the penguins, we were to have a comfortable warm home, whence we would make excursions to the rookery, perhaps 4 miles away. Perhaps we would manage to get our tent down to the rookery itself, and do our scientific work there on the spot, leaving our nice hut for a night or more. That is how we planned it. That same night we started to dig in under a great boulder on the top of the hill, hoping to make this a large part of one of the walls of the hut, but the rock came close underneath and stopped us. We then chose a moderately level piece of moraine about 12 feet away and just under the level of the top of the hill, hoping that here in the lee of the ridge we might escape a good deal of the tremendous winds which we knew were common. Birdie gathered rocks from over the hill. Nothing was too big for him. Bill did the banking up outside while I built the wall with boulders. The rocks were good. The snow, however, was blown so hard as to be practically ice. A pick made little impression upon it, and the only way was to chip out big blocks gradually with the small shovel. The gravel was scanty, but good when there was any. Altogether things looked very hopeful when we turned in to the tent some 150 yards down the slope, having done about half one of the long walls. The view from 800 feet up the mountain was magnificent, and I got my spectacles out and cleared the ice away time after time to look. To the east a great field of pressure ridges below, looking in the moonlight as if giants had been ploughing with ploughs which made furrows 50 or 60 feet deep. These ran right up to the barrier edge, and beyond was the frozen Ross Sea, lying flat, white and peaceful, as though such things as blizzards were unknown. To the north and north east the Knoll. Behind us Mount Terror, on which we stood, and over all the grey limitless barrier seemed to cast a spell of cold immensity, vague, ponderous, a breeding place of wind and drift and darkness. God, what a place! There was now little moonlight or daylight, but for the next 48 hours we used both to their utmost, being up at all times by day and night, and often working on when there was great difficulty in seeing anything, digging by the light of the hurricane lamp. By the end of 2 days we had the walls built and banked up to 1 or 2 feet from the top. We were to fit the roof cloth close before banking up the rest. The great difficulty in banking was the hardness of the snow, it being impossible to fill in the cracks between the blocks, which were more like paving stones than anything else. The door was in, being a triangular tent doorway with flaps which we built close in to the walls, cementing it with snow and rocks. The top folded over a plank and the bottom was dug into the ground. Birdie was very disappointed that we could not finish the whole thing that day. He was nearly angry about it, but there was a lot to do yet and we were tired out. We turned out early the next morning, Tuesday the 18th, to try and finish the igloo, but it was blowing too hard. When we got to the top we did some digging, but it was quite impossible to get the roof on, and we had to leave it. We realized that day that it blew much harder at the top of the slope than where our tent was. It was bitterly cold up there that morning, with a wind force 4 to 5 and a -30 temperature. The oil question was worrying us quite a lot. We were now well into the 5th of our 6 tins, and economizing as much as possible, often having only 2 hot meals a day. We had to get down to the Emperor penguins somehow and get some blubber to run the stove which had been made for us in the hut. The 19th being a calm, fine day, we started at 9:30 with an empty sledge, 2 ice axes, alpine rope, harnesses and skinning tools. Wilson had made this journey through the Cape Crozier pressure ridges several times in the Discovery days, but then they had daylight, and they had found a practicable way close under the cliffs which at the present moment were between us and the ridges. As we neared the bottom of the mountain slope, farther to the north than we had previously gone, we had to be careful about crevasses, but we soon hit off the edge of the cliff and skirted along it until it petered out on the same level as the barrier. Turning left-handed we headed towards the sea ice, knowing that there were some 2 miles of pressure between us and Cape Crozier itself. For about half a mile it was fair going, rounding big knobs of pressure, but always managing to keep more or less on the flat and near the ice cliff, which soon rose to a very great height on our left. Bill's idea was to try and keep close under this cliff along that same Discovery way which I have mentioned before. They never arrived there early enough for the eggs in those days. The chicks were hatched. Whether we should now find any emperors, and if so whether they would have any eggs, was by no means certain. However, we soon began to get into trouble, meeting several crevasses every few yards, and I have no doubt crossing scores of others of which we had no knowledge. Though we hugged the cliffs as close as possible, we found ourselves on the top of the first pressure ridge, separated by a deep gulf from the ice slope which we wished to reach. Then we were in a great valley between the first and second ridges. We got into huge heaps of ice pressed up in every shape on either side, crevassed in every direction. We slithered over snow slopes and crawled along drift ridges trying to get in towards the cliffs. And always we came up against impossible places and had to crawl back. Bill led on a length of alpine rope fastened to the toggle of the sledge. Birdie was in his harness also fastened to the toggle, and I was in my harness fastened to the rear of the sledge, which was of great use to us both as a bridge and a ladder. 2 or 3 times we tried to get down the ice slopes to the comparatively level road under the cliff, but it was always too great a drop. In that dim light every proportion was distorted. Some of the places we actually did manage to negotiate with ice axes and alpine rope looked absolute precipices, and there were always crevasses at the bottom if you slipped. On the way back I did slip into one of these and was hauled out by the other 2 standing on the wall above me. We then worked our way down into the hollow between the first and second large pressure ridges, and I believe on to the top of the second. The crests here rose 50 or 60 feet. After this I don't know where we went. Our best landmarks were patches of crevasses, sometimes 3 or 4 in a few footsteps. The temperatures were lowish, -37°. It was impossible for me to wear spectacles, and this was a tremendous difficulty to me and a handicap to the party. Bill would find a crevasse and point it out, Birdie would cross, and then time after time in trying to step over or climb over on the sledge I put my feet right into the middle of the cracks. This day I went well in at least 6 times, once when we were close to the sea, rolling into and out of one and then down a steep slope until brought up by Birdie and Bill on the rope. We blundered along until we got into a great cul-de-sac which probably formed the end of the 2 ridges, where they butted on to the sea ice. On all sides rose great walls of battered ice with steep snow slopes in the middle, where we slithered about and blundered into crevasses. To the left rose the huge cliff of Cape Crozier, but we could not tell whether there were not 2 or 3 pressure ridges between us and it, and though we tried at least 4 ways there was no possibility of getting forward. And then we heard the Emperors calling. Their cries came to us from the sea ice we could not see, but which must have been a chaotic quarter of a mile away. They came echoing back from the cliffs as we stood helpless and tantalized. We listened and realized that there was nothing for it but to return, for the little light which now came in the middle of the day was going fast, and to be caught in absolute darkness there was a horrible idea. We started back on our tracks and almost immediately I lost my footing and rolled down a slope into a crevasse. Birdie and Bill kept their balance and I clambered back to them. The tracks were very faint and we soon began to lose them. Birdie was the best man at following tracks that I have ever known, and he found them time after time. But at last even he lost them altogether, and we settled we must just go ahead. As a matter of fact we picked them up again, and by then we were out of the worst, but we were glad to see the tent. End of chapter 7, part 3.